Okay, we're halfway through Ezekiel 1. Most of the rest of this book will not be this difficult, but we're starting off with quite a whopper here, okay? Where, like I said before, Ezekiel doesn't speak in figurative poetic language like most of the prophets do. But he does speak in visions, and he is seeing these things and nobody else is seeing, and he's trying to communicate that in words. So this is going to take a while to kind of parse through this opening vision. So we're halfway through chapter 1. Starting now in verse 19. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go. And the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. The wheels, that is. When the creatures stood still, the wheels, also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Now, we just got done saying that. Okay, this is another classic example, and we see this all throughout the Old Testament, the Bible in general, but especially in the Old Testament, of them saying the same thing 2 or 3 times in a row. We've been seeing that since early in the book of Genesis. Okay? And that is a feature of all of ancient writing, whether you are talking about the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures or any other writing left behind, especially religious or political in nature, which was all the same thing back then. There's a lot of repetition in ancient writing. They say the same things over and over and over again. In fact, if anything, the Hebrew Bible has less repetition than most of the ancient writings left behind by cultures of that region of the world at that day and time. So Ezekiel said the same thing like 2 or 3 times in a row to get the point across. Basically, these wheels and the living creatures are the same entity. Like, these wheels are an extension of the living creatures. We didn't see the wheels in Isaiah. We didn't see them in Revelation. The wheels themselves are just there to communicate in Ezekiel to communicate the point that they're part of God's chariot, and God's chariot can move. Okay. Isaiah didn't need to see the wheels because God had not left Jerusalem in Isaiah's day and time. John didn't need to see the wheels because in the time of John and Revelation, God was understood to be everywhere already. Ezekiel needs to see the wheels because he needs to understand that God is not limited to just being in Jerusalem. God can be there in Babylon with Ezekiel and the rest of the captives. He does not have to be limited to just that temple, that building, and that one city of the world. So Ezekiel needs to see the wheels. Isaiah didn't need to see the wheels, and John didn't need to see the wheels. So in those visions of the same beings, we don't see the wheels. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures. Okay. Now we're moving up. So Ezekiel's gaze, he saw initially the storm cloud coming towards him, and he saw the creatures that were in the storm cloud. And he saw the wheels that were connected to the creatures somehow. Now he's turning his attention to what's above the creatures. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse. There's that word again. We saw this way back in Genesis 1, where it's translated as expanse. And it separates the waters above from the waters below. This word is very clearly referring to something solid, because as we read here in Ezekiel, something is sitting on this expanse. So again, I said it before when I read Genesis 1, that concept of the creation does not need to be taken literally. And it shouldn't be, because we know the sky is not solid, even though it's described in Genesis 1 as being solid. And one of the ways we can know that is because that same word, expanse, is used here in Ezekiel 1, and it is very definitely referring to something solid, because there's something sitting on top of this expanse. And we see this expanse again in Revelation, where it's portrayed as a sea of glass that things are standing on. In Genesis, the expanse was the sky that kept out the waters above from the waters below. which is not what the sky actually does, and it never has been what the sky actually does. So we know that Genesis 1 is not portraying a literal account of the creation of the material universe. But I covered that back when we did Genesis 1 all those months ago. Anyway, spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice, and awesome. Under the expanse, their wings were stretched out one toward the other. We already mentioned that. But now we're getting the idea that they're actually holding up this thing, this expanse, this sheet of ice, or whatever it may be. We originally were just saying that these wings were attached to each other, or pointed to each other. But then we mentioned they were actually elevated, they were like lifted upwards somehow. But now we're getting the idea that they're actually holding up this sheet of ice, or this expanse, or as Revelation calls it, the sea of glass. Under the expanse, their wings were stretched out one toward the other, and each had two wings covering its body. Remember, Isaiah saw another pair of wings covering their faces, but they're not covering their faces here in Ezekiel. They have to remember also what Ezekiel, now the imagery that Ezekiel will eventually connect this to, he doesn't connect it here, is the cherubim in the temple. When they made the Ark of the Covenant, and when they made the temple later on, they designed these cherubim figures to go with it. So they made the Ark of the Covenant, we read about this in the Exodus, and they put these statues of cherubim, which they didn't describe what they looked like at the time. But they described, the word is just used cherubim, and they had these wings that were pointed towards each other, one either end of the Ark. There were only two of them at that time. And they had these wings that were pointed to each other, and they served as a sort of seat. And God somehow, in some cloud form or something, took his position above this seat. And it was viewed as the seat or throne or mercy seat of God. In the temple, when Solomon built the temple, they put the Ark of the Covenant in it, and in addition to the Ark of the Covenant and the two cherubim figures that were already built on top of it, they had two other larger cherubim figures that were built in the Holy of Holies that shrouded even the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, to cover that even. Okay, so that is the imagery that's being connected, that we're being called to mind here. Ezekiel will eventually connect these living creatures with the cherubim, and he'll realize that this is what the cherubim actually are. These imperfect replications that Moses was instructed to make in the desert with the Ark of the Covenant, and they were supposed to put representations of them in the curtain of the tabernacle and on the walls and doors of the temple, and make statues of them to go in the temple. Like these things that they were told to make to decorate the temple with were imperfect depictions of these creatures. He hasn't realized that yet, but he will later on. So these creatures are being depicted. These creatures are the spiritual reality of what the physical replications on earth were meant to depict. Although Ezekiel hasn't realized that yet. He won't realize that until a few chapters from now. So just like the cherubim fixed statues that were built on top of the ark and put in the temple were seen as kind of serving as the seat of God, because they covered the ark, they covered, and then God kind of came down and sat on top of them, figuratively speaking. These cherubim, the real cherubim, the actual reality of the cherubim, are doing the same thing. They are serving as the seat of God. So under the expanse, their wings were stretched out one toward the other, and each had two wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings, like the roar of rushing waters. I don't know what that means. They're supposed to be flying with their wings. Maybe the wings that cover their body, extend to fly. I don't know exactly but apparently they make some kind of noise. Like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. So normally, I guess, when they move, their wings are flapping or something, whatever wings do. But when they stand still, then the wings cover the body. Apparently, it's what it seems like. Then there came up, so apparently these things are getting closer to Ezekiel by flapping their wings and moving towards him. And then when they get close enough, they stand still and lower their wings, apparently. Then there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads. By the way, let's go ahead and talk about this expanse. No, actually, let's wait a minute. Let's read the next couple of verses. Then we'll flip back to Revelation and see the Revelation account of this expanse and the throne. Let's get to the throne first here, though. Then there came a voice from above the expanse, above their heads, as they stood with lowered wings. So they came to a stop in front of Ezekiel, apparently, and then they lowered their wings. Ezekiel has mainly been looking at these living creatures as they come towards him. He saw the storm clouds, and he saw the living creatures in the storm clouds. Then he noticed the wheels, either on the ground or in front of the living creatures, or however. Then he noticed that there was an expanse above them that they were kind of carrying. Then they came near enough to him to stop, and they lowered their wings. And now he's hearing a voice from above that expanse. Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire. And from there down, so from his waist down, he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So it finally dawns on Ezekiel what exactly he's seeing here. He's seeing God appear in front of him in this vision, this likeness. And when I saw it, I fell face down. And I heard the voice of one speaking. Let's flip back to Revelation to get another account of these things, all this stuff. Because John in Revelation talks about the same thing. He starts with the figure of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. He kind of does it in reverse order of Ezekiel. So in Revelation 1, starting in verse 10, on the Lord's day I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a voice like a trumpet. He starts with hearing the voice. And he turns around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like a son of man. We'll talk about the son of man idea later. Dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades." We know this is Jesus. Obviously, we have this much more material to get through before we get to that point, but we know that this is Jesus. Then we have him, the letters that he wants John to write. And after this is Revelation 4 now. And there I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I had first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." I was in the Spirit, like Ezekiel was at the Kibar River, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. So he's starting with the figure, the voice, and then the figure, now the throne. So he's going kind of in the reverse order of Ezekiel. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. A rainbow resembling an emerald encircled the throne. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones. We don't see this in Ezekiel. And seated on them were 24 elders. We'll talk about these elders a long time from now when we get to Revelation next year or whenever it is. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. So we don't see that in Ezekiel. That's a twist in Revelation that we don't see in Ezekiel. So we'll get to that then. From the throne came flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. Before the throne, 7 lamps were blazing, These are the sevenfold Spirit of God. We'll get to that later too. Also before the throne was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. Later on we're going to see things standing on the sea of glass. This is the expanse that Ezekiel saw. In the center around the throne were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and in back. Again, John doesn't see the wheels, so the eyes that were on the wheels are now on the creatures themselves. The first living creature was like a lion, the second like an ox, the third had a face like a man, and the fourth was like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings, and was covered with eyes all around. So they have 6 wings again. They're probably covering their faces again. This time the beings themselves. Unlike in Ezekiel where they had 4 faces that each represented one of these different creatures. In Revelation, they apparently have their faces covered again like in Isaiah, but each being itself represents one of these different creatures. Day and night they never stop saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. So that is the account in John, of John in Revelation that Ezekiel just got done seeing here. So the idea being communicated here is that God is basically supreme over everything. The chariot wheels, we're seeing essentially God's chariot. And it matters because Ezekiel, in his mind, in his understanding at that point in time, he sees God as being Jerusalem's God. So this chariot, this idea that God can leave Jerusalem and go to Babylon is important to Ezekiel because he didn't necessarily know that or believe that before he had this vision. Now, by the time we get to John and Revelation, we've already seen Jesus declare, for example, at the end of Matthew, that he has been given authority over all the earth. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Jesus. We don't need to see the chariot again in Revelation to know that God is everywhere and sees everything. In Isaiah, we didn't need to see that either because God was still in Jerusalem. It was not important to Isaiah at that time to be consoled with the idea that God can leave Jerusalem and go be in Babylon in exile with the captives, because Isaiah was not in exile with the captives in Babylon. Ezekiel is, however. So Ezekiel needs to be comforted and consoled by the idea, by knowing that God is not limited to just being in Jerusalem. It was believed at that point in time that your gods were local gods, okay? Everybody in the world believed in gods, or God, and they believed in each other's gods too. Like, Babylon did not disbelieve in Israel's God. You know, we read in Jeremiah how the Babylonian commander, Nebuzaradan, under the instructions of the king, went to Jeremiah and specifically singled him out for special treatment after the invasion, because Jeremiah's God had predicted had told the Babylonians that they would be successful in their mission. Assyria did the same thing. The Rabshakeh in Assyria went to Hezekiah and said, your God is displeased with you. I've been given permission to do this by your own God, because you've destroyed his high places. So the leader of Assyria and the leader of Babylon believed in Judah's God. They swore allegiance to their own gods instead. Okay, they didn't disbelieve in the existence of the other nation's gods. They just believed that their gods were better. And I think that was even a problem in Judah. Even to a faithful priest like Ezekiel doesn't believe in idols, as we'll read about later. He calls them basically dung pellets. But Ezekiel may have trouble with the idea that Judah's God can also be active in Babylon. Like, that is something that Ezekiel in 593 BC needed to know. So God showed him this vision with his moving chariot to communicate to him and impress upon him the idea that God can leave Jerusalem. He can be with Ezekiel and the other exiles in Babylon, and does not have to be limited to just the physical temple in Jerusalem. And that's going to be an important part to Ezekiel's message, because as he speaks, the point that's being communicated is that the temple is going to fall. God has left it. Not only is he not limited to that temple, he has left that temple. And the temple is going to fall. So they're holding on to this temple as a crutch, because they believe that God cannot allow his temple to fall. because then he would destroy himself. He would destroy his own stronghold, because his stronghold was his temple. That's how all the gods were back then. And they need to be taught otherwise. Ezekiel even needs to be taught otherwise, maybe not to the degree that the other people do, but even Ezekiel needs to be assured in this vision that God can leave Jerusalem and be present with him in Babylon. So that's why the details of this imagery differ slightly. In Isaiah and Ezekiel and John and Revelation, I think they're all depicting the same thing. In Isaiah, he saw the throne of God right there in the temple. And the train of his robe filled the temple, and the 4 seraphs were there in the temple. And Ezekiel, God has left the temple and is coming to Babylon to talk to Ezekiel. And in Revelation, we already know that Jesus has authority over all and dominion over all the earth. So we don't need to see the wheels or chariot again, because we already know, John already knows that God has dominion over all the earth all at once. So that is why the imagery. And also remember, these are not physical creatures. Their form does not have to stay the same. They can appear differently to Isaiah, Ezekiel, and John, because unlike a physical being, they are not limited in their physicality to being appearing a certain way all the time. It could be that each of these men perceives these creatures somewhat differently based on his own perception, based on his own expectations or life experiences. Remember, the imagery that Ezekiel is depicting here draws heavily from imagery that would have been very common to the people of that day. He doesn't even realize at first what he's looking at. It's going to take a while before it occurs to him that, hey, these are the cherubim. These are the creatures that are depicted in the temple in Jerusalem, and the artwork, and on the tapestries, and the curtains, and on the walls and doors. He doesn't even realize that now. This is nothing. Anyway, so that is the first chapter of Ezekiel.